Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, after a devastating report about deaths in long-term care, the Minister of Health issued a statement, and he said, and I quote, "We take these reports very seriously. We will look into this important matter and have more to say once we have completed this work," end quote. But yesterday, the Premier had no answers for the families impacted by the decision to delay declaring outbreaks. And the Minister brushed off questions, and I quote, said, "not supported by the evidence," end quote. Well, that response seems in stark contrast to the statement that the Minister issued just last Friday. The 192 families who lost loved ones deserve answers, and they deserve to see the evidence for themselves. They deserve full accountability. So to the Premier, what are the terms of reference for the review announced last Friday? Will they be made public? And when can families expect a report, as promised, on what went wrong?
Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, and thank you to the member for her question. The member will know, because the issue here is the declaration of outbreaks in long-term care, but the declaration of outbreaks in general, that those decisions are made under the Public Health Act. The authority is delegated to the provincial health officer and to medical health officers, and they make the very difficult decisions as to whether to proceed or not to proceed with outbreaks, outbreak declarations, which have, of course, serious implications. They are very well trained to do it with 5 years of training in public health. That doesn't mean that their decisions can't be and certainly won't be reviewed or questioned. But what it does mean is that it's important in these times when of course, there's a desire to second guess those decisions, depending on the results after the fact. I think we have to, I think, reflect on that authority. This is not, by the way, an avoidance of accountability by me. I strongly support our public health teams around BC who have acted consistently, and not just consistently, but courageously to respond to the very difficult challenges in long-term care of public health. I think all of these issues will be subject for questions in the future, but for the moment, what we're doing in public health is a vaccination program designed to protect those most vulnerable, and that program is having a very positive effect. That is our focus now, as well as ongoing measures to prevent infection, and I think, I hope all members of the House will recognize that while decisions can be questioned, that our public health teams are doing an excellent job, giving it everything they have, and that their authority to make these decisions is founded in the best principles of having science guide our response against the spread of communicable diseases.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental question.
Well, while I appreciate the lengthy answer from the Minister, that's not at all what I asked him. On Friday, this Minister went out of his way to issue a statement in response to what was a serious concern expressed about the deaths of 192 people in long-term care after a specific policy decision was made. We're well aware of the vaccination numbers in British Columbia. We're well aware of the incredibly hard work of frontline workers and public health officials. This is about a specific policy decision that was made. And on Friday, the Minister seemed pretty willing to step up and talk about doing a review. So today, the answer missed the mark. What's changed since Friday? The answer today completely ignores the concerns of 192 families who lost their loved ones following the implementation of a specific policy. The Minister promised a review and accountability last Friday. And let's be clear, asking legitimate questions on behalf of British Columbians is important, it's necessary, and we're going to continue to do just that. So let's start with this one. The Premier needs to stand up and he needs to explain what his government knew about the policy, when he knew it, and this minister needs to outline for 192 families and British Columbians exactly what the review will entail and when they can expect answers. That's the least this minister can do today.
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And nobody, and I don't believe one time in a public briefing or a private briefing, have I suggested that anyone doesn't have the right to ask questions. I think that is an absolutely legitimate role for the Leader of the Opposition to play. So I think the suggestion that I'm saying that they can't ask questions is just incorrect. What I'm saying is that the challenge of declaring outbreaks, which is something that public health has taken on throughout this, is based on their authority under the Public Health Act. And they are constantly and consistently addressing that question and refining those policies. What I said yesterday, and this is clearly a response to those questions, is that the suggestion, I think, Honourable Speaker, the suggestion to link and to make a causal link is not supported by the evidence. That's what I'm saying, and that's certainly the response of public health. But that said, all of these decisions, of course, will be the subject of questions in the future. They absolutely will be. And the response in detail and the analysis in detail of the response of public health to these questions, indeed my response and ministers, will be the subject for review. But for the moment, what our job is to keep British Columbians safe. What our job is to pursue a vaccination program that is already having a positive effect and will continue. And our job is ensuring that British Columbians are safe across the province. And that's what we continue to intend to do.
Member for Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hindsight is 20/20, and it does help us actually examine what happened and move forward. And I'm encouraged by the minister saying all of these issues will be examined. But yesterday, the minister said that there was no evidence to support the reports of government mismanagement. Unfortunately, we haven't actually seen the evidence, and he has yet to answer the question as to what he's actually looking for. You see, the public is concerned that the minister and the premier are just simply trying to wash their hands of this story. But let me read from the policy document issued by the government, and I quote, "Notification of all residents, families, staff, and other service providers is not required." End quote. The same goes for restrictions on admissions and visitation and asymptomatic testing, not required. Will the Premier tell families why this disastrous policy was implemented at long-term care homes?
Minister of Health.
Honourable Speaker, with great respect, the member is conflating what I said yesterday. She made some specific, I think, allegations yesterday, which I disagreed with, and I said so. And I think that's a reasonable way to respond to those things. To conflate that with the suggestion that I don't think questions can be asked is just simply incorrect. There was a series of issues raised by the member, from rapid testing to the declarations of outbreaks. But what we're doing in British Columbia, and it is different than other jurisdictions, is giving the authority and the responsibility on issues that are fundamentally medical issues based on the experience of public health to public health professionals, and then supporting them when they take action. We are not on issues such as testing, as the opposition, I think, is suggesting we do, and it's a legitimate approach, overruling them on some of these questions. Instead, we are providing the resources, the means, and the supports necessary to ensure that public health does its work. It is very challenging work. Dozens and dozens, for example, of Vancouver Coastal Health employees went in to support people at Little Mountain. They did so in good faith and with great dedication, showing their commitment. Nobody, I think, is washing their hands of anything. And not an hour, not a day, not a minute goes by when people in public health and myself as Minister of Health aren't concerned about what's going on in long-term care in the pandemic.
Member for Kelowna Mission, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ultimately, the responsibility is this government, this minister, and this premier. The government's decision to delay declaring outbreaks came at the same time a peer-reviewed study was published showing that BC's earlier precautions were actually working. So after safety measures were relaxed, we saw 42 outbreaks and 192 deaths of seniors. Cause, effect. But there has been no explanation from the Premier about who signed off on this policy and how it was justified. Will the Premier give these families those answers that they so desperately want and deserve?
Minister of Health.
Well, the member is right to this extent. Studies that have compared the response of British Columbia in long-term care to other jurisdictions have said that British Columbia has done, relatively speaking, a good job. I think, though, Honourable Speaker, and I think this is important to recognize, the costs and the consequences in the care homes mentioned by the Honourable Member and in care homes across BC are significant. The cost, for example, of the limitations on visits, which we changed, if to use the member's term, we weakened in June 30th to allow social visits. We again changed in the terms of the Honourable Member, weakened in March of 2021 to further allow visits in long-term care. This was not, however, in my view, a weakening of those provisions. Instead, this was a response by public health and by the government to ensure that people were allowed to understand the consequences of the measures in long-term care and to ensure that people, to the maximum possible extent, were allowed social visits, which have extraordinary positive effect. So all of these decisions, whether those are the right decisions or not, will be the subject of discussion. But we are in the middle of a pandemic, and our goal right now, I think, is to keep people safe, to get people vaccinated, and to continue to do the work that public health needs to do with the support of this legislature and of the government to the maximum degree deal with a pandemic that has, of course, harmed people around the world.
Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, we saw the results of this government's damaging and short-sighted approach to managing our forests. Today, the RCMP are starting to remove protesters at Fairy Creek, and what is unfolding is an unacceptable failure of this BC NDP government. The lack of leadership is causing economic, social, and environmental consequences. It's not just Fairy Creek, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a damning report from the Forest Practices Board found that BC timber sales is failing to protect old growth and biodiversity in the Namint Valley. Their report reveals deep flaws in our management of old growth. They found that these failures are, quote, creating real risks to ecosystems, end quote. BC timber sales needs to be reined in, and we need systemic change in this ministry. One of the recommendations of the Old Growth Review Panel from last year was part of implementing immediate protections for high-risk ecosystems. And it's for this government to direct BC timber sales to cease auctioning off old-growth timber. My question, through you, Honourable Speaker, is to the Minister of Forests. Will the Minister follow through on the Premier's promise and instruct BC timber sales to immediately cease development and defer selling timber in high-risk old-growth areas?
Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And I want to thank the Forest Practices Board for the report that they undertook. And as the member knows, the board plays a really key role in helping BC to develop sound forest and range practices. BC's timber sales is addressing the board's recommendations in its operations, and they've already begun this important work and are working towards completing the recommendations. And I just can't stress enough how our government understands how critically important old growth forests are to British Columbians. And that's why we have already undertaken to complete the recommendations that were made by the old growth report. We have already protected hundreds of thousands of hectares of old growth. And we know that there is more work to be done, and we are going to do just that.
Member for Saanich North and Island supplemental.
The minister has certainly risen in this House on a regular occasion to stress how important it is. But the lack of action is what the people of British Columbia are seeing, Mr. Speaker. The fact that the recommendation number 6, which was immediate action from this government, has yet to be completed, is proof that the action side of this equation has not been followed through on. Because, you know, Mr. Speaker, a second damning report came out last week. The Auditor General of British Columbia slammed BC's management of our conservation lands program. He found that the BC government failed to protect species at risk and critical habitats that they rely on. The ministry lacks strategic direction. They lack data. Their plans are decades out of date. This is an embarrassing list that is very extensive, Mr. Speaker. This government says the right things. This minister says the right things. She promises changes. They accept recommendations. Yet, over and over and over again, nothing changes. Status quo in the forests. Lots of talk in here, not a lot of action out there. Mr. Speaker, we need an overhaul of this ministry, and we need a minister who is seized with the urgent need to create substantial change on the ground. My question through you is to the Minister of Forests. Will she acknowledge that despite the rhetoric, despite the empty promises, that her own ministry is systemically failing to manage our forests responsibly and sustainably? Will she accept that urgent systemic change is needed within this ministry, and will she commit today to doing this work with the urgency that is needed?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our ministry is doing the work that's needed to be done. And I want to thank the Auditor General for their report as well. And point out to the member that BC actually leads the country with the highest percentage of protected areas of all provinces and territories in Canada. But we know there is more work to do. And the Auditor General's report that the member references has made some helpful recommendations on how we can do better, and which we accept. And that's what our ministry does. You know, we look at what we need to do, and we accept that and move forward. And work is already underway to accept those recommendations. We are doing the work that needs to be done. You know, we have been doing the work for the last 4 years since we've been government. We accept those responsibilities. We accept there's more work to do, and we are doing it. We are doing it in collaboration with the ministry that is working hard to ensure that we get the work done. You know, for many years, the previous government refused to take action to protect old growth. They refused to take action to ensure that unique ecosystems and critical habitats were protected. And we are working to fix that reckless approach. We are prioritizing reconciliation. We are prioritizing environmental protection again. We are doing the work that needs to be done because we accept the responsibility. So stay tuned, member. We are doing that work.
Member for Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The Premier said, don't worry. The Minister of Tourism had to be shamed into getting a briefing. And now, a bill that threatens our cruise ship sector has been unanimously passed at the United States Senate. This has forced the Premier to belatedly take the minimum action possible so he can be seen as doing something. Meanwhile, the threat to Victoria, Vancouver, and Prince Rupert is growing, and there's a small chance to stop our ports from being bypassed. Has the Premier asked the federal government to support technical stops in BC waters where anchors are dropped but no passengers disembark?
Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. This is a bill that has come forward from the Alaskan government. We're actively in discussion with our federal counterparts. I mean, the most important thing I want to emphasize, Honorable Speaker, is how valuable the cruise ship industry is to our tourism ecosystem. All hands are on deck. Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure is working with his colleague in the federal government. I've had active conversations with Minister Jolie. The Premier is meeting with the Alaskan senators in the coming days. And, you know, I just want to make it really clear for members at home that the proposed bill is a temporary measure. And I have to call out the opposition for trying to drive home this narrative that this is going to be a permanent measure when it's proposed to be temporary. The ban will be lifted when the restrictions are lifted from the federal government. The most important thing we need to focus on right now, Honorable Speaker, is the vaccination rollout, people being safe, and we're going to welcome back tourists right to our ports because we're a magnet for visitors all across the world. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Member for Richmond North Centre Supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is so hard to take the answer from this minister seriously. She should really listen to the stakeholders and also listen to the U.S. politicians. They are trying their best to make it permanent. The Premier said there was no way the bill would pass. He was wrong. The minister said, I quote her, "The opposition is fear-mongering. It is a proposal that hasn't gone anywhere. The possibility of the legislation passing is very unlikely," end quote. So dismissive. It's not just us. The head of the Association of Canadian Travel Agencies, Wendy Paradis, said, I quote her, "We are very concerned that this temporary change to the U.S. Passenger Vessel Services Act could become permanent," end quote. So again, to the Premier, has he written to the federal government asking them to consider BC waters for technical stops?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. As I said, our government is all hands on deck with the federal government. We're paying close attention to the issue. But I want to just correct the misinformation that the member is sharing. First of all,
members, let's listen to the answer, please.
The bill may have passed. It still has to go through the House of Representatives. It still has to be signed off by President Biden. It still needs to be approved by the U.S. Center for Disease Control. There are steps that need to be taken. And, you know, shame on the member for coming in here trying to suggest that there's a permanent measure when the bill is very clear. It's a temporary measure. Let's quote the senator. While we have sought a temporary legislative fix to the domestic laws that require a port call in Canada, our long-term goal is to keep the system of mutually beneficial tourism between our two great nations intact. Those are the facts, Honourable Speaker. The member opposite can come in here drumming up all the fear that she wants. We are working with the sector. We're advocating with the federal government. We are going to do our level best to defend our ports and make sure that we're a destination of choice for cruise ships as soon as those bans are lifted. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, if the minister truly valued this industry, she and the Premier would have taken action many, many months ago when concerns were first raised. You know, the BC's cruise ship sector is responsible for $2.7 billion in economic impact every single year. It accounts for 20,000 jobs. The cruise ship sector has no confidence in this Premier and this minister. And I quote, "The likelihood, the feasibility of this being passed right now in the middle of a global pandemic is pretty slim," end quote. That was the minister explaining why she wasn't making this a priority months ago. Now, while the Premier and the minister don't see a threat, the industry does, and there is significant worry that temporary will become permanent. And I quote, "The severity, if it were to happen, really ratchets up the concern," end quote. Those are the words of Ian Robertson of the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority. And it's no wonder that he's concerned. Cruise ships are responsible for $180 million of economic impact every year right here in Victoria. So can the Premier please tell us today what specific steps he's taken to ensure that BC's cruise ship industry has a future here in our province.
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Victoria's port, Vancouver's port, we're a magnet for tourists, for international tourists, and our industry is going to continue to thrive. But right now, there is a travel ban. Right now, there are limitations for our port. There is a proposal for a temporary measure. The official opposition are coming in here acting as though somehow they have a looking glass into the future, drumming up fear that there's a permanent measure when the bill is unequivocal. It's a temporary measure. It will be lifted as soon as the ports are open. We are relentless in our advocacy. The Premier is meeting with the Alaskan senators. We're in active conversation. The Minister for Transportation and Infrastructure, Friday, Mondays, on the phone with transportation. They are alive to our concerns. We are the West Coast, we are the best coast, and we're going to ensure that we have a thriving industry. But to speak to Ian Robertson, we were on the phone with him yesterday. He is a valued partner. We respect his leadership. We are listening and we're acting, and we're going to do that advocacy with the federal government to ensure that we have a thriving cruise ship industry. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Kamloops South Thompson supplemental.
Well, with all due respect to the minister and to the premier for that matter, they said that the United States would not pass this legislation. And the United States has passed the legislation. So excuse me if we don't trust the minister on her word here. Mr. Speaker, then again, when we raised concerns, when we raised concerns 2 months ago, we were dismissed. When our critic wrote to the minister a month ago, she was dismissed. When questions were asked in estimates last week, we were dismissed again. While the Premier waits, he's putting at risk $3 million of economic impact in the Port of Vancouver. Every ship that comes in is at risk, $3 million of economic impact in Vancouver. And let's be clear, the United States are defending themselves, and they're doing so with rare, unanimous cross-party support. You know, Senator Mike Lee, who represents that obviously dominant cruise ship state of landlocked Utah, is blunt that the changes should be made permanent. He has said that on the record multiple times. And this would cost BC's tourism sector billions of dollars. The Premier prefers to bungle along, the Minister chooses to bury her head in the sand, and the 20,000 men and women whose jobs depend on the cruise ship sector are going to pay the price. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has terribly botched this file. What is he going to do to ensure that BC's cruise ship sector has a future? When is he going to stand up and fight for these British Columbians' jobs?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I mean, it's no surprise that the official opposition are going to come in here drumming up fear, as they always do. It's not as though the tourism industry isn't already affected by a global pandemic. To add extra fear, they're adding salt to the wound. So shame on the members opposite, but let's go to the facts. They talked about the law. You know, they talk about being experts. A bill was passed through the Senate, has to go through the House of Representatives to become a law. It has to be signed by the President of the United States, and it needs the approval of the CDC. So you know what? There are some steps that need to be taken, but for right now, all hands are on deck. We are working with the sector because we know that we are confident, we are arrogant in our confidence that we are a port of choice. There's a mutual interest for visitors to visit our port here in Victoria and Vancouver, and we want to do the same in Alaska. There's mutual interest. That is the signal that the senators of Alaska have sent in their proposed bill, which is intended, I'm going to say it very slowly, intended to be temporary. It is not a permanent measure. If the members opposite are advocating for that, shame on you. Have it back to British Columbians and the tourism industry that needs us right now. More good news to come, Honourable Speaker. Thank you very much.
Member for Abbotsford West.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. 2 months ago, when we brought this issue to the minister's attention, she didn't even know about the legislation, Mr. Speaker. She wonders why people don't have confidence in her answers today. It's because, as my colleagues have said, she and the Premier were openly dismissive when the warnings were fired two and a half months ago. A mere blip, the Premier said, hasn't got a chance of passing in the U.S. Congress. Won't ever pass, said the minister just 2 months ago. Well, it passed. It passed unanimously. And it might not have been unanimous because there were members in the U.S. Senate who didn't want to stop at making it a temporary measure, Mr. Speaker. There were members of the U.S. Senate that wanted to make it a permanent repeal of the legislation that helps protect the tourism sector in British Columbia. And the minister pretends all will be well. And now, as the bill shifts to the House of Representatives, I don't know if the minister is reading the Hansard, or if she is, or if she is.
No props, member. No props.
Or if she is, she's missing the parts where members of the U.S. Congress are now aggressively advocating to make this a permanent repeal of the legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a solution. And if the minister wants to demonstrate that she actually cares about those tens of thousands of workers, about the impact of the cruise ship sector on tourism, she will stand up in the House today and indicate that she is and the government are supportive and will advocate for the solution that has been offered, that they will ensure that everyone is aware that British Columbia supports a technical stop that will preclude the need for any of these legislative changes in the U.S. Congress, and that the protection of British Columbia workers will be paramount. Will she do that, stand in the House today, and support technical stops for these cruise ships?
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. What I will do is I'm going to stand up for an industry that's been impacted by a global health crisis. And what I'm going to do is continue all hands on deck with my colleagues, including the Premier, the Minister of Transportation, advocating with the federal government, and nothing's off the table. Technical stops aren't off the table. We are working around the clock to ensure that we defend our ports, our cruise ship industry, our tourism sector, and to remind everyone at home, this is a temporary measure. We are going to ensure that we go back to status quo as soon as the borders are open. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
The bell ends question period.